Hey everyone, welcome back to POL 935 Computational Social Science. And this week I have a relatively short video for you where I talk about creating mass collaboration online. So, outside of the social sciences, mass collaboration is already quite common. We have a lot of research projects, for example, in biology or biochemistry, that involve large scale collaborations between researchers across various institutions. So, for example, when we look at the first paper on the initial sequencing and analysis of the human genome published in Nature, we see an author page, we see author information that spans an entire page, or potentially even more. There are other examples, such as in physics, where papers, for example, this one on a research project involving the Large Hadron Collider that was published and that had more than 5,000 co-authors listed on the paper itself, right? So outside of the social sciences, in the natural sciences, there are large-scale collaborations already. And the social sciences are certainly moving in that direction, but their collaboration involving large numbers or large numbers of researchers across institutions are still less common. But the important point here is that these collaborations don't only have to involve large numbers of academics at universities and institutions. There are also research projects that basically take advantage of collaboration or mass collaboration online by having people who are not necessarily trained in that specific scientific field, nevertheless help with either data collection efforts or potentially with computational contributions, right? So one example here is an online game where lay people were basically invited to play an online game that ultimately helped researchers fight Alzheimer's disease. And if you want to check out this example, you can click on that link. It is still live. You'll go through a little a little intro about the research project, and a little starting guide, and then you can play an online game that ultimately helps Alzheimer research, right? So these are examples of mass collaboration that go beyond the scope of researchers who are actively involved in writing the paper, but actually involve large scale collaboration online involving people who are not necessarily researchers themselves, right? And so this is fairly common outside of the social sciences, but the key point here is that this also provides a lot of potential to be leveraged in the social sciences as well. And we'll talk through a couple of examples in that vein from the social sciences. All right. So the way this is discussed in the bit-by-bit book, and the way I will kind of follow the discussion here, is that there are basically three broad types of mass collaboration. Some are more common or already kind of implemented in the social sciences, and some are slightly less common, but still provide a lot of potential in the future, right? The first one is human computation, and I'll talk about each of those in more detail in a second. And human computation tasks basically involve splitting up a large problem into small little subtasks, and then asking people to kind of perform these simple small tasks, and then aggregating them up together, right? So the social science example that we're going to talk about here is crowd coding political manifestos, for example, right? So that's one example. For example, you could recruit workers through Amazon's Mechanical Turk to complete small manageable tasks that don't necessarily involve subject expertise, but that help you, for example, code political text or images and things like that, right? So that's one major form of mass collaboration. The second piece is open calls. Open calls are slightly different in the sense that it's not about splitting up a task and having a lot of people basically complete small subtasks and then aggregating those, but rather it's one large problem that is difficult where the answer is kind of it's easy to check whether the answer is or it's easy to kind of compare the quality of different answers. But ultimately, it's not about aggregating a lot of answers, but it's about finding the best answer, essentially, right? So the Netflix prize is one example. Folded, where it's about protein folding, is another example, or peer to patent, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The last form of mass collaboration is distributed data collection, which is really interesting as well. And these are examples where people, for example, eBird is the example that is discussed in the chapter, where people who are already engaged in birding as a hobby basically collect data that is then used by scientists, right? So scientists can't, be everywhere and collect data on bird migration, but if people, basically collect these data anyhow, and we can kind of ask them to collect data on behalf of the scientists, then that can actually be used in the research process, right? And we'll have an example that we'll discuss in our Q&A session that kind of uses this type of distributed data collection as well, which is really, really interesting. For example, in that case, in the context of conflict studies. But before I continue, let me just briefly outline the next couple of sections, which I will probably combine in one video because they will be relatively short. We'll talk about the first part, as I said, human computation, then open calls, and then distributed data collection in a little bit more detail. I'll mention a couple of papers that are related to that, and then we'll kind of discuss them in more detail in our Q&A session. And there's also some advice on designing your own mass collaboration to the extent that you can, for example, implement that as part of your research project as well, at least at a smaller scale. So before I continue in the next video, your to-do list for this week, so ideally to be completed before our Q&A session on November 4th, is of course watching the lecture videos and reading the chapter in the Bit by Bit book, chapter 5, after we had a couple of sessions now in the past couple of weeks where we had our workshops and talked about your own research proposals. We're going to go back to kind of finishing those last couple chapters in the Bit by Bit book, and then please read the Vanderwind and Humphreys book, Crowdseeding in Eastern Congo, using cell phones to collect conflict events data in real time, which is a great example of this mass collaboration, or the third kind of type of mass collaboration, the distributed data collection. And we're going to discuss, I'm not going to talk about this in detail here in the videos, but we're going to discuss it in the Q&A session. And then lastly, please finish assignment 3. We already talked about it a bunch in our last Q&A session, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in the next upcoming one. Please finish the last coding assignment, number 3, which is posted on Canvas as well as our Studio Cloud. And as always, that's due the day after our Q&A session. And then just as a gentle reminder, it is time to now start working on your final paper. We already had our proposal session, and by the end of next week, I'll give you some more written comments on your proposals as well. So just a reminder, the first version of your final paper will be due on December 2nd, because we will have another peer review round, and then we'll have a presentation round, and then you'll have a chance to submit your the final version of the paper, right? But keeping in mind that the first line is first due date or first submission deadline is December 2nd, so now is the time to get started and really get working on your paper. All right, so that's it for the overview. In the next video, I will talk about human computation as well as the other types of mass collaboration.